My name is Dr. Stephen Scoltetti, and I'm a member of the faculty at the University of Mississippi, where I serve as director of the Declaration of Independence Center for the Study of American Freedom. The mission of the Declaration Center is to ensure that students and faculty and citizens across the state of Mississippi have opportunities to study and think about the nature of American freedom. The Declaration Center is pursuing its mission in a number of ways. For students, the center sponsors and supports an academic minor in freedom studies. We're also working to link talented students to fellowships, internships, and scholarships. For faculty, the Declaration Center sponsors research. And finally, the Declaration Center is putting on a number of public events. The following event features Jared Rubin, professor of economics at Chapman University, and Mark Koyama, an associate professor of economics at George Mason University. They're discussing their recently published book, How the World Became Rich: The Historical Origins of Economic Growth. I'd like to also give a special word of thanks to my colleague, Dr. Josh Hendrickson, who's the chair of the Department of Economics here at the University of Mississippi. He was kind enough to moderate the event for us. I hope you enjoy it.
Okay, so I'll get started. My microphone's working. So obviously, when we say this, we don't mean everybody in the world is rich, but what we mean is that by historical standards, most people in the world actually enjoy fairly high, or very high living standards. So to put this into context, imagine you're one of the richest guys in England in 1200s. You're one of the barons about to sign Magna Carta. You would not have central heating. You would not have AC. You would be wearing kind of woolen, itchy underwear. You wouldn't be eating fresh meat unless it was the season when you could slaughter the meat. Otherwise, everything would be salted and preserved. You would have very limited diet, and you would likely, die in your, if you survive childhood, you'd be dying in your 40s to your 50s. And you wouldn't have a lot of medicines, vaccines, antibiotics to treat even relatively basic ailments. So in some kind of basic, fundamental human sense, the standard of living that even somebody not especially rich, even somebody in a country like, let's say, Turkey, or a country like Morocco, so even countries which are not rich countries, they're just middle of the road countries. You would have access to all of these things which a rich guy or a baron or a lord in 1200 wouldn't have. And that statement about 1200 applies pretty much to any time before the Industrial Revolution, so before 1800.
So I guess a way to follow up on this question is we need to start thinking about why the world became rich. And we're on a college campus, and so I think like a popular argument that I hear on college campuses is that, well, maybe they're rich because this was all just colonization and exploitation. So how do we respond to claims like that?
Yeah, it's so we lay out 5 kind of the deeper seated reasons why certain parts of the world have become rich and why certain parts of the world eventually caught up and why certain parts of the world have been very slow to catch up. Colonization is one of the arguments that is made in the broader literature. Now, whether the parts of the world that became rich because of colonization is extremely debated. It's less debated that certain parts of the world have really slowed or not become rich because they were colonized, particularly parts of sub-Saharan Africa, where large parts of the population were taken unwillingly. But there are many other underlying reasons for why different parts of the world became rich at different times. The ones we lay out are geographical reasons, like climate, but also the disease environment, things like that really do help explain certain periods of growth. There's institutions, which is a compelling explanation, I think, in many respects, in that different societies have different institutions. What we mean by that are those factors in societies which kind of incentivize people to act in different ways, like political institutions are a really big one. So having some constraints on executive power, checks and balances, things like this typically correlates extremely highly with economic growth. And there's been plenty of good economics work and work in other disciplines that suggested that correlation is not just a correlation, it's causal. We also look at cultural explanations, which you do have to be very wary when you talk about culture, because culture can be used to justify, racist or Eurocentric type of explanations. But we also, that doesn't mean we shouldn't think that culture is important, right? How people view the world, the amount of trust they have in people they don't know, things like this have been shown to be quite important for determining growth paths of societies. We also look at demography, which is something that, how many births and deaths society has, but particularly how many children people are having. Because one of the reasons, Mark was noting that prior to 1800 or so, almost everyone who lived, probably 95% plus of the people who ever lived were right around $3 to $4 a day in terms of their income in modern day dollars, accounted for inflation, which is right at subsistence, more or less. One of the main theories, which I think does a really good job explaining much of the world up to 1800, is known as the Malthusian theory, which is really saying essentially people would continue to have children until they couldn't feed those children anymore. So even when societies did have good things happen to them, like some type of technological advance, they just have more kids. And at some point, that stopped. And it stopped at different places where societies had what is known as a demographic transition to having fewer children. So, and then there is colonization, which again, I think is some of the real leading theories on colonization and relating it to, say, industrialization suggest that certainly colonization played a role in the way industrialization happened, but the counterfactual of, well, what would have happened had colonization either been differently or not had happened at all, that doesn't necessarily mean you don't get the Industrial Revolution. It just looks a little different. So I think that we have to really consider all of these explanations. And one thing that we really push in this book is that there's really no silver bullet. All of these things matter, and they matter differently in different contexts. So how England industrialized or how Britain industrialized, was a little different than the U.S., and it's way different than what was happening in China in the late 20th and now. And we really need to understand kind of cultural context, historical context to understand why that's the case.
So I wonder how we can put this in the context of other things. So like another sort of famous book for explaining kind of how the world became the way it was like Guns, Germs, and Steel, right? And so everything in that book is all about sort of like geography. So maybe can you talk a little bit about what that argument is, but then also kind of like what do we know now that might make us think that maybe that sort of geographical explanation doesn't explain as much as
yeah, sure. I can jump at that one. So I still teach Guns, Germs, and Steel to my undergraduates. So it's a great book if you haven't read it, and it argues for geographical explanations for explaining the differences in between why some parts of the world have a lot of stuff and others don't. So the shortcoming of that book is it purports to answer this question, how the West became rich, and it doesn't answer that question actually. It answers a different but also interesting question, which is how was it that it was Spanish or Europeans or Eurasians who went to the Americas and basically spread their disease and conquered the Americas, as opposed to the Aztecs or the Incas landing in the coast of Spain, colonizing the Spanish, right? So that's rather than explaining the origins of economic growth, it explains something about why Eurasia was better positioned circa 1500 relative to the Americas, particularly the Americas. And so it does so by looking at where certain crops were originally located. So it's very difficult to domesticate crops for agriculture. It's very difficult to domesticate wild animals. So there are very few domesticatable species of large mammal. And Eurasia, so when I say Eurasia, I mean Asia plus Europe, places like the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East, what's now Iraq, Syria, Iran, that's where a lot of early agriculture developed. And Diamond argues that because of the way the geographical axes of Europe and Asia are aligned, that it's more horizontal than it is vertical. And that means that these early technologies like grain agriculture spread relatively quickly from, say, Iraq all the way to, say, Spain or Western Europe, as did other technologies. And so did the domesticatable animals, so cattle, pigs, sheep. And this early start just gives people in China, people in France, people in any part of Eurasia, a bunch of technological advantages over the people in the Americas. And one of the key advantages they end up having, and this is the germs, part of guns, germs, and steel, is disease. So because they live with their animals, so they're living, neck and neck or cheek by jowl with their pigs, they're getting like a lot of, flu. We talk about swine flu. Like a lot of these respiratory diseases come from birds, chickens, or they come from pigs and cows. And so they had all these pathogens. And when we went to the Americas, the people there were not had not been exposed to them before. So that gave this huge edge, demographic edge, that the Europeans inadvertently spread diseases which killed large numbers of native peoples. So Diamond's book is a great book, and its explanation for the early advantage Eurasians had versus people, particularly in the Americas, is basically something we more or less endorse. We think it's correct in our book, but we don't think that explains the origins of economic growth, partly because the story is finished in 1500. But the Spanish in 1500 were very poor by modern standards. They didn't have an industrial revolution. So he doesn't answer that question at all, actually. And geographical explanations in general they go play an important part of the story, as Jared said, but on their own, they seem to be insufficient. So at the very least, you need to complement them with some of these other factors that we've mentioned, like institutions, for example.
So I kind of see two perspectives in the world on population. And so I see some people sort of lamenting that fertility rates in the West are going down. But then I see other people saying, well, actually, this is maybe for the best because maybe we'll have fewer people consuming fewer natural resources, and so maybe that will be good for the planet. So what does the growth literature tell us about population? How should we think about population?
So I think that there's kind of two separate questions in what you're saying. In a pre-modern world, when we don't have very high rates of innovation that can kind of break us free from this kind of these population traps, reducing fertility rates is one of the only ways to raise the standard of living. Because as I said in my answer the last time, what in the pre-modern world, what you'd have is anytime you'd have these one-off technological advances, or sometimes the other way around, where you'd have something like the Black Death that kills a third or a half of Europe and parts of Asia. This does raise living standards for those people who survive, or these technological changes. But the issue is that those technological changes in particular, there was no wave of them. There'd be one-offs here and there. So eventually, over a generation or two, you'd have more births, and those people would eat up the extra, all that extra productivity. So in the pre-modern world, one of the things that was really the only way, and no society really ever solved that. What ended up happening in the 19th century, kind of in combination with massively increased rates of technological change, you have movements towards fewer children, which these two things combined to really raise the standard of living in those societies that experienced both of these things. Now, when we're talking about kind of more modern populations, and there's, most of the rich world now, has below replacement level birth rates, which is around 2.1 per woman, and I think one could certainly make the argument in terms of thinking about climate change and things like that. That's almost a separate that's almost a separate issue from the economic one. The one thing that we note in the book, though, is that if we really want to have solutions to the biggest problems, including climate change, but also other ones as well, it's economic growth and more people. Because one thing that, when you think about all of the large parts of world history, most people were at subsistence. They couldn't spend time thinking about how to solve big problems. They were thinking about working in the field, getting enough to solve their daily problems. The most likely way that we as humans continue to live, and certainly in terms of thinking about climate and things like this, is by producing, having more people that are able to solve these issues. So that means there's still 1 billion or so people that are on the specter of poverty. Now, most of those people currently living are in either South Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa. And that, of course, that's not it. And what I mean on the spectrum, obviously there's massive inequality in places, including the United States. Well, I'm talking about people living on a few dollars a day. Very different than even most of the poorest people in the U.S. People that are living on just a few dollars a day are not, that's potential brain power. That how many missed Einsteins do we have? So when we think about in some of the figures you see, the projections are really dire. By 2100, there's certain parts of the world that are going to have, like Japan being one, kind of one of the leading ones, a fraction of the population they have today. This, on the one hand, yes, this means that we will be consuming fewer resources. On the other hand, it means that there's going to be a lot less brain power to really push forth on what those next major innovations, those sparks of genius that will allow society to really maybe either consume differently or consume in a way that is has much less problems for the planet. So I think a message of our book is we should be wary of those types of arguments, and it's also an argument that we try to be somewhat agnostic on a lot of things, including we are very clear that there are downsides to economic growth. But I think Mark and I, and you can correct me if I'm misspeaking for you, think that the positives are almost certainly outweigh the negatives. And when we think of just the quality of life for not just for billions of people, but also the potential to solve the world's problems as well is intimately tied with the process of growth.
So Julian Simon is the guy who's I don't know if maybe some of you have read him. He's the guy who's most famous for this argument that human beings are the ultimate resource. And I think that's where we come down to, especially in the modern world. So every person is potentially somebody who could solve a problem, as well as a person who's using up resources. And as used for solving problems, which is more important than the resources they use up.
So I'm wondering if you guys can kind of dig into an explanation of institutions a little bit. Like you guys brought this up, but this seems to be like the first of all, it seems to be the go-to argument for economists a lot of times is it's all just institutions. But I kind of have two questions related to institutions. So one is just sort of informational, like what do we mean and why do they, and why do they matter? But then the second part of that is like, how do we know that the causation is not going from the world getting rich to having better institutions?
Yeah, so that's a tricky question, that last one. So we're in the Declaration of Independence Center, right? So in some sense, that's the type of thing we're talking about in terms of political institutions. So Jared gave the definition earlier. So economists have a slightly abstract definition of institutions. So we don't necessarily always mean specific institutions, but we mean the incentive, the rules in our society which give us incentives to act certain ways. So to obey the law, or to be corrupt, or to innovate or not to innovate. We think about institutions as these structures of incentives, which systematically push people's behavior in different ways. So when we look across countries or across periods of history, it seems like, this is exactly what Jared was saying, but the set of institutions, that is institutions which constrain the power of the state, constrain arbitrary power, institutions which support the rule of law, these institutions seem to be strongly associated with human flourishing. They enable markets to function, and they enable a broad number of people to participate fully in the economy. And so, but that's both, we often distinguish, or economists distinguish between the economic institutions, so things like the property rights system or the rules governing business formation. How easy is it to start a business, or do I need the permission of some politician, right? Can I just set up a store, or do I need to pay some local strongman for this? I was just teaching a class on on Russian history actually yesterday, and so under the Tsar in Russia, you needed the Tsar's personal permission to set up a corporation, right? And so that's an example of like a type of institutional rule which we don't think would be overall conducive for prosperity. So that's like the first part of the question. The second part is like, what comes first? Is it the cart before the horse? We think the institutions are incentivizing, particular behaviors. So we think that a particular set of institutions, which is conducive to kind of markets working effectively, will encourage investment, encourage business formation, encourage people to interact with the market, encourage people to innovate. So we kind of, we think it's natural, kind of coming from economic theory, that it's institutions which are leading to the incomes increasing and the growth. But you can't rule out some of the reverse causality. Sometimes people think, it's a luxury, right? You could afford not to be corrupt if you're Sweden or Norway because you're rich. But in a poor country, the only way the local civil servant will make any money is by taking bribes. So, maybe you can grow your way out of these dysfunctional institutions. So I don't think we can rule out that second thing. But we definitely think that there's a strong argument to be made that institutions are one of the most important factors which explain, the economic takeoff of the last 250 years.
Yeah, maybe I can add something there too. We do think that that clearly once you get kind of maybe in what you might call a virtuous cycle where you get good institutions, it leads to some type of good economic outcomes. Then maybe that strengthens the quality of institutions. Or as Mark was kind of getting at, you might have it go the other way, the downward spiral where bad institutions, where there's corruption or bribery, things like that, lead to bad economic outcomes, which make those institutions even worse. Certainly happens. And I think one thing that, Josh, I think your question was getting at too is a big question that Mark and I, but really economists of all and political scientists too of all stripes try to understand is, well, why do some societies have good institutions from an economic outcome perspective and other societies have bad ones? And that's where we do need to think about these other things that we've been talking about, like geography or like culture or maybe even colonization, right? These are things one thing I think to be made clear is that institutions do not just arise in the ether. They're different across societies, which is one thing that makes them a compelling explanation. But then you have to kind of peel the onion back and say, well, why are they different in different societies? And that's one of the things that are.
And this is why you've got to study history as well. This is why I think the history is really important to understanding economic development.
So you mentioned culture earlier, and I think like most people, when they think of cultural explanations of prosperity or something, they think of something like the Protestant work ethic or something of that nature. And I don't think that that's what you're talking. Actually, I know that, but for the sake of the audience, I don't think that's what you're talking about. So, what do you mean by culture, and what do we know about the importance of culture for contributing to economic growth?
Yeah, no, this is an important distinction to make because when I gave kind of our five bullet points earlier, culture was one of them, and I made the point that cultural explanations can be used in a very bad way, and in the early 20th century they largely were, especially a very Eurocentric at best. Saying there's something special about European culture. Weber was one of those who looked at different. He looked at China. He looked at South Asia, looked Middle East, and then said, all right, there's something different that's going on in Europe, and then ascribed it to a certain work ethic that came from specifically this kind of Calvinist doctrine that predestination, that to show that you were going to heaven, you had to have earthly success, and the way to get earthly success was to work hard. And he was right about there being a correlation at the time, and historically, between the spread of Protestantism and economic success. Even if you look at the world's wealthiest countries since the spread of the Reformation, the first, the Dutch Republic in the late 16th century, after it broke free from Spanish rule, that they were Protestant, and quickly, as soon as they broke free, became the wealthiest country. They were supplanted by Britain, probably sometime in the 18th century or so, which was supplanted by the U.S. in the late 19th, early 20th century. All these are Protestant countries. Weber was looking at his homeland of Prussia. The Protestant areas seem to be doing better than Catholics. You do see a broad correlation. The question is, again, now this would be a case where correlation does not always equal causation, and we have to be careful when ascribing cultural explanations, especially when we see these types of correlations. When we describe culture, we're using it there's a field, a growing field of cultural anthropology, which really looks at culture as these kind of shared heuristics that people have on how they view the world, how they take inputs perceived inputs from the world, and in order to really navigate the world, you have to have shortcuts to understand and process the world around you. These are often cultural in that they're shared among different societies, and different societies have different types of cultural attributes. So some of the ones that have been studied, say recently, by economists are things like trust. So how much do you trust outsiders, people you don't know, people that aren't part of your group? This is an incredibly important one for markets to function in a good way. If you fundamentally don't trust people that you don't know, it's very unlikely you're going to engage in market activity. By nature, you're dealing with people you don't know in that case. And we do know things like trust of outsiders varies immensely across societies for different, as Mark was just saying, for historical reasons, right? And one thing about culture that there's been a ton of studies now in the last, say, decade and a half has shown is that it persists. So there might be some type of cultural elements that come up hundreds of years ago for reasons that are completely unrelated to anything that is relevant for today, yet those societies still have those kind of cultural elements because it passes down. Whether you like it or not, a lot of what your culture, the way that you perceive the world was passed down from your parents or your guardians, and then some of it was also from your peers, maybe your teachers. But this is something that does tend to pass down across generations, and there's been a lot of work now that has shown it's very sticky. What this means is that there's some societies, and especially in kind of pre-modern settings, that just have very different attitudes towards actually things like work and that we know matter for economic success and economic development. And really another thing that it does is it means that institutional formation is different across different societies. So we think about, a big one would be, think about kind of cultural attitudes towards democracy, cultural attitudes towards, the winner of free and fair elections being the rightful person to lead a society. That differs immensely across societies based on their historical past, based on their cultural past. That also means that you can't just export something like democracy. Democracy, the way it formed in Britain, the way it formed in the US, is not necessarily going to work in parts of, say, like the Middle East that have maybe been under autocratic rule for a while, that were also colonized, that experienced European rule in a very different way. So, and the reason that, and then this is yet another reason why institutions are different across societies, is that culture kind of dictates how institutions might work, because it dictates how people take those inputs from the institutions. Mark was just saying institutions provide these kind of cost benefits, these incentives for acting. Well, that clearly interacts with the society's culture.
So I think a lot of the explanations so far have really centered around how do we explain the differences between rich countries and poor countries, and kind of what are those kinds of characteristics. But I think another important aspect of this story is that the growth story is relatively recent, and yet when we look at some famous ancient societies, they seem pretty advanced. So why didn't the growth that we've experienced today, why didn't that just happen in the Roman Empire?
Yeah, so I can I wrote a blog post on this one, so I can attempt to answer it. So when we look at archaeological records, or if we read about the size of the city of Rome, so it's a million people around 100 CE. It's got a very sophisticated grain shipping system to feed this million people. So a million people in the pre-industrial world is pretty impressive, because these people are not farmers. They're living on a surplus of other people. They're all non-farmers, and they have running water. They have aqueducts. They live in insular or flat or apartment buildings, which are multi-story. And they're capable of magnificent, kind of extremely impressive works of art and architecture. If you look at the Parthenon built by the Emperor Hadrian, or the Colosseum built by Vespasian, these are immensely impressive, right? So if you were a superficial observer, you might imagine that these societies are, not uncomparable to us. But when we look kind of into the details, like what do we see? We see that like life expectancy in the city of Rome seems to have been terrible. So like, it's hard to estimate these things, but all these tombstones suggest people are dying in their 20s or 30s. So they're really dying young. Right? They have a lot of epidemic disease. They're very malnourished. So the Romans are really short, basically. They're like, the men are about 5'2". That's why they think the barbarians, the Germans, are really giants, because the barbarians are taller. So on all material standards of living that we can think about, the majority of Romans were like stunted, malnourished, prone to disease. And so, and part of the reason for this is something Jared already alluded to, which is these societies had not escaped the Malthusian trap. So they were still, despite their splendors, they're still limited by kind of biology in some sense. So Rome just kept attracting more and more people who wanted to work in the city, wanted to make their fortune, and so it became really overcrowded. And as you know from kind of Econ 101, basically, supply goes up, but it's going to push the wage down, and it's going to push it down eventually to subsistence. So why doesn't Rome escape the Malthusian trap? That's this interesting puzzle, which we don't have a great answer to, but some arguments have been suggested. One is that they don't seem to have sustained technological change. So they have sporadic inventions. They have really good concrete, for example, and they have military innovations, but they don't have a breakthrough in terms of increasing a productive capacity of the economy. They don't have labor-saving technological change. One argument for why they didn't have that was slavery, so abundance of cheap slaves. You're conquering foreign territories, you're bringing in a supply of enslaved people continuously. That might undermine the incentive to innovate along those dimensions. Other people would say that the cultural attitudes are just really bad for commerce and growth. The senators look down upon the merchants and the traders. If you're honorable, you earn money from land. That's like the noble way to live. And so there could be cultural kind of preconditions which just make it hard for people to really want to build firms and continue to invest. You get rich, and then you become a senator, and you buy some land and you farm, basically. So there are a host of arguments we could give for why the conditions weren't quite right, basically. And in many respects, the Roman Empire is quite fragile, I think. And their high point is in the 2nd century CE, around 150. And then they get this big epidemic disease shock called the Antonine Plague. That seems to knock them off course. And also then they're subject to a lot of invasions from outsiders. So they have a security problem. This is actually relates to some of your work, Josh. They have to provide for defense, and that's expensive, and that's a burden on their economy, basically.
And so I think another aspect of this then too is it's not just that it's kind of a recent phenomenon. It's also not uniformly distributed, right, across the world, right? So growth really begins essentially in England and in the Netherlands and places like this. So what's special about Northwestern Europe? Did they win some kind of lottery, or why did things start there?
Yeah, I'll try to take this. So, I think one thing that's I think kind of clear. It's not to answer that question. It can't be geographic determinism, because if you told somebody in the year 1000 that some part of Eurasia in 750, 800 years from now is going to have this massive economic takeoff that then eventually spreads to large parts of the world and would become rich, certainly at least England, maybe not the Low Countries, but England would be one of the last places, not just in Europe, but also all of Eurasia, that you would expect. It was relatively poor. There's a reasonable amount of infighting, things like that. But by 1700, Britain's one of your best guesses, I think. One thing we note in the book is that, and I used this term before, there was really no one silver bullet. There was nothing you can pinpoint and say, this is what Britain had that no other parts of the world had. What it did have was a series of things that kind of just happened to come together. And really, one thing that, I think that really knowing the history, and really when we brought this together, we kind of knew, but also really realized is that there was nothing predetermined about this. There were a lot of different things that could have happened differently, where maybe Britain doesn't industrialize, maybe industrialization looks very, very differently. So the economist and economic historian Joel Mokyr has made some very, I think, convincing arguments that there are cultural elements which are really pan-European, that you're really dealing with the Enlightenment and these new ideas that people can, that science rather can be used for the betterment of humanity. This was something that really historically it really wasn't the case, in part because science hadn't really been able to massively benefit humanity. And eventually when those types of cultural ideas spread, you at least start to get people innovating. And one thing that has to be explained if we want to understand why certain parts of the world became rich first, why it happened so recently, is you have to be able to explain why Britain became so innovative in the latter half of the 18th century. That is really what the first industrial revolution is about. It's called a wave of gadgets. It's this kind of constant, not just big things like the steam engine. The steam engine is a huge innovation in this period, but also a lot of improvements upon things like the steam engine, but also all these other, especially in kind of the cotton textile industry, and new industries in metallurgy that arise during this period. We really have to understand why this was all happening in one place at one time. Cultural explanations are part of it, but as I just said, that can't be the only thing, because those cultural changes were all throughout Europe. Why England or why Britain? Britain also had really big internal markets, so it was something that did differentiate it from the Dutch. The Netherlands was a really kind of a small place. Britain was larger, both geographically and in terms of people, which allowed for all these productive capacities to really find markets for their goods. It faced the Atlantic, which maybe distinguished it from places like, say, northern Italy, which throughout the most of the medieval period was the leading part of Europe economically. But once the opening of the Atlantic arises in the 16th and then 17th centuries, that changes things and makes having an Atlantic-facing ports become a really important thing. Again, that can't be it, because then, why didn't it happen in Spain, or Portugal, which were leaders there? Another thing Mokyr and some of his co-authors point to is that Britain had an abundance of skilled laborers. Now, this is something that there's a variety of historic reasons why this was the case. One reason he points to as this being so important, and I think we both agree that this is at least part of the story, is that once you get all of these new innovations coming about, you get these cultural changes which really encourage these types of innovations. Now you have people that can implement the innovations, that can repair these machines, and that's really important for actually transforming technological change into something that's economically meaningful. That was also something that Britain wasn't exactly unique in, and there were parts of the world that had skilled laborers. There are free cities in, say, modern day Germany that had these too, but those cities also didn't have other things. There also had institutions, which something that the political institutions in particular, something that Britain and the Dutch did share, were reasonably constrained political institutions, meaning that there was a parliament in Britain that could constrain the crown. This was something that was not always the case. This was something that happened through the course of really the 16th and 17th century. It was the rise of parliamentary power. Prior to that, you would not say that the King of England was overly constrained. The Dutch had this as well, and was one of the reasons that they became wealthy. There are actually several more reasons, including a common one that's given is access to coal, which England did have in the north, and they built a lot of internal waterways, canals and roads, and could kind of ship it around, which meaning that being an island helped. But again, England was not the only place that had coal. The Ruhr Valley in Germany, China had access to plenty of coal, parts of Russia had access to plenty of coal, and it was easy to mine coal. But again, none of these explanations alone explain it. And this is, I think, again, we keep saying this, but we are economic historians, and we think history is important. Understanding history really matters. We can't just theorize about history. We need to understand history. We need to know we also do need theory. We need frameworks. We need to we can't just describe what was happening. We need to try to understand why it was happening, which is what we try to do in this book, and what I think social scientists, it's one of our relative strengths anyway. But yeah, I mean, I think that again we can't, and which is why it's a book, not just one small little article. And this book could have been 3 times the size. We really have to understand all of these conditions, and really, in a sense, Britain was kind of lucky that it had all of them kind of coalesce at one time.
Well, so I think, like, when we think about the Industrial Revolution, one of the hard things to do is to think about, like, what that actually is. Like, I mean, I think we can all picture in our minds, like, what the Industrial Revolution is, right? We picture factories and all these kinds of things. But kind of the big difference is we went from using exclusively kind of like labor power, right, to using like non-labor power. So now we have like machines, or like you kind of mentioned coal. Now in the modern world we think oil. So like, I also wonder, to what extent is kind of the Industrial Revolution just a story of like sort of better uses of energy?
So that's there's a guy at Stanford, Ian Morris. He wrote a book where he really emphasizes this. So I didn't have the exact numbers to hand, but precisely as you say, when you start burning coal for steam engines, basically you're accessing all this stored energy, like via photosynthesis. Tens of thousands or maybe millions of years ago, basically, the photosynthesis, and the wood turns to charcoal. Eventually, it gets kind of fossilized as coal. So you've got all this stored energy underground in the form of things like coal and other fossil fuels. And basically, what people are able to do, beginning before the Industrial Revolution, but taking off during the Industrial Revolution, is access this new source of energy. So, if you think about hunter-gatherers, maybe only have access to human power. Once we domesticate animals, we have some animal power, we have some horsepower. But once we have an industrial economy, we can access all this stored energy, and that's transformative, obviously, in our ability to power locomotion, heat our homes, and so on. So I think historians have previously kind of commented on this, like this is what's decisive. It's an energy revolution. It's an energy using revolution. But that's true and it's fine. What economists bring to the table is the question like why, right? If it was why were these natural resources not being harnessed before? It's like now people will say. Countries in the Middle East, say Bahrain or Qatar, or Saudi Arabia, are rich because of oil, right? But oil was just black water. It was just a nuisance until the late 19th century, early 20th century. It's only when you have the technologies which are able to utilize these energy sources that you can turn them into riches. So the economists' kind of value added is thinking through the incentives, thinking about like why was it cost effective in the 17th century, began in the 16th, 17th century for the British to start basically using coal as a fuel, and then how did that then incentivize the development of technologies like steam power, which can utilize the coal. And it's really a story about prices, market incentives, encouraging the it's mostly a story about these demand-side incentives, allocating people's talent and human capital in such a way that they're trying to, extract energy from, say, coal as efficiently as possible. There's also a supply side, which is what Jared was just saying, which is, you needed a population of very educated, kind of innovative scientists and other thinkers to theorize, like, how does a steam engine work? That required quite a lot of scientific knowledge because it required an understanding of a vacuum. But what's really key about why it's Britain that makes people in Britain that make this breakthrough is really the incentives they have to innovate in a particular way. So to answer your question, it's about energy transformation is totally crucial. It's critical, right? But you need to understand why people in a particular society, particular point in time, had the incentives to exploit energy in new ways.
So I'm going to ask kind of a different kind of question here. Is what are most of our conversation so far has been kind of like, hey, explain what we know. And so, what are the big outstanding things that we don't understand very well that maybe you know, need to be kind of the focus of sort of future research?
I think we both probably have our own thoughts on this. I can start. One thing that, I mean, I think that we are getting a better grasp on, but which is among the most important questions for, you know, we say, you know, as Mark said in the beginning, we understand the whole world is obviously not rich by either contemporary or historical standards. Now, the world has seen, even in our lifetimes, an immense improvement in human welfare. You know, even just in China alone, about 1 billion people have been lifted out of abject poverty. In several other parts of the world, that's the case. Now, there's at least 1 billion people or so, that number is declining, that are still there. Now, I think one thing that we don't know as well, but we are getting better traction on, is why what some of the things we know work in certain parts of the world don't seem to gain traction in other parts of the world. We know stuff about institutions, right? We have a pretty good idea that good institutions, good meaning, you know, however you define that, lead often or at least highly related to economic development. So you have international organizations like, you know, the World Bank or the IMF that try to really incentivize countries to have better institutions by, you know, attaching money to it. And it's worked in a couple places, but for the most part, it just doesn't work. And, you know, in some cases it's been the United States, in some cases it's been, you know, more like NATO coalition that have tried to actually just implement institutional reforms in other countries. Occasionally they work. In many other places, they don't. Now, one thing, you know, again, we talked about before, oftentimes this is cultural, you know, in the way we think about culture interacting with institutions. In other cases, we really don't have a great idea. And in terms of the big question that really, I mean, I think in the end, one of the reasons I became an economist, you know, really got interested in this stuff in my undergraduate days, was thinking that, you know, the toolkit we have when you go through even an economics undergrad, it can be really powerful in thinking about how we think about the poorest in the world, right, and how we think about ways that might alleviate that poverty. If it were as easy as, you know, just transferring institutions or, you know, changing culture, whatever that means, it would have been done by now. So there's still a lot out there that I think we're getting a better grasp on. And in terms of the really big question, though, I don't think, you know, I think that, you know, this is for the next generation of social scientists and policymakers and everywhere in between. Hopefully, you know, hopefully some of those policymakers pick up our book, not just for our sales, but we think it does have something to say to them, because that's where I think not just the lowest hanging fruit lies, but it's really where the most important advances for human welfare will be had, hopefully over the next generation. I'm pretty optimistic that we'll figure this out, but we haven't yet. What do you think, Mark?
Yeah, I had a similar thought, but it's about institutions, that we have academic knowledge, but academic knowledge and the knowledge you would need to implement policy are two totally different things, basically. So, like, as academics, we flatter ourselves, so we really understand stuff, we really know stuff. But actually, like, you know, when it comes to the actual implementation, it's often very different. So that's partly one reason why people were very naive in the ability to export, say, democracy. But even, you know, to take, you know, even rich countries today face growth slowdowns. We have problems with getting economic growth going, and they face coalitions of people who, you know, for their own interests are not in favor of growth, maybe. And even though we have some idea of like what policies would be good, we can't get those policies through. So to take an example, I think this is relevant for many parts of the US as well, but it's particularly relevant in the UK, which is where I'm from. Ever since I studied economics, I said, look, the UK has a housing shortage, and we have very, very restrictive laws about housing that keeps up, you know, it really is a limit on growth. I've been saying this for 20 years, basically. And I wasn't the only person saying it 20 years ago, and like by about 5 years ago, basically everybody who knows anything about the UK or looks at the house price would agree with this. Like, house prices are too high, right? But the UK government has been unable to do anything about this, and all their policies either fail and even set out to fail. So they continue to subsidize demand. So their solution to house prices being too high is to offer basically cheaper credit, basically. Make it cheaper to borrow to buy a house, and all that does is push up demand, push up prices if supply is unchanging. So there's some massive disconnect between the academic knowledge of what's a good policy and the implementation. Another example, which is more relevant globally, is that economists have long argued that basically some kind of carbon tax is probably the best way to deal with global warming is going to be some type of carbon tax in terms of it's the least distortionary. But no one wants a carbon tax. Voters don't want it, so it never happens. And then instead you get some kind of bizarre combination of policies in response to climate change, some of which are effective, some of which probably are not effective, right? But that's what we end up with, even though as economists, we actually have a broad consensus about what the best policy would be. So there's a big disconnect between understanding academically what's a good idea and understanding how we could implement it. Part of the reason I study history is that when you study history, you can abstract away from those policy concerns to a large degree, because no one gets upset if you say this intellectual property rights regime in 18th century England sucked. Basically, no one's gonna want to get comments, or it's not a newspaper story. But if you comment on current policy, then obviously you can get embroiled in all kinds of debates, which are mostly kind of very time-consuming and often have little consequence.
So I'm going to apologize in advance for this question. All right, but this is the question that everybody, that you probably get everywhere. And so when I think about China seems to be doing the opposite of everything that you say, right? So they're trying to limit their population. They don't seem to have good political institutions, but they seem to be growing. They seem to have grown rapidly over the last few decades. And so what do we think about China? Do we think that China is just going to be another one of these kind of historical growth reversals? Do we think this will stop, or do we think that, or is this a kind of challenge to some of the other lessons that we've learned about the rest of the world?
I'll start on this. I mean, so I think the way to think about China since 1978 is that it was a country that had around 1 billion people at the time, and a vast majority of the population was not that far above subsistence. It was a very, very poor country, and there was a lot of low-hanging fruit. So when market reforms came in, this was something where the low-hanging fruit was relatively easy to pick, even in a society that was still, and still is, of course, autocratic. The key there, though, is that these were market reforms. China very much, while it's quote-unquote communist, is very much beginning in the late 70s and still today is very much a market-oriented economy, and just moving all of that really underutilized labor into more productive pursuits was really one of the kind of the easiest boons that was out there in the world. And then there are other places today, I think that if similar things end up happening in, say, in parts of South Asia, we're going to see similar things in sub-Saharan Africa, where there's really a lot of low-hanging fruit as long as the right reforms are made. And China did make some reforms, even in an autocratic setting, that really allowed that to be picked. Now, I mean, I think we're actually already starting to see some, not just slowdown, but one thing that I've long been saying about China is that there was all this kind of low-hanging fruit in China that could get you 6 to 10% growth per year, which is massive growth, to be clear. And which is why China has moved out. And really, when you look at the abject poverty rates, the around $3 a day or less, it's less than 1% of China is now there, which is again an amazing human accomplishment. It's something. It's probably the biggest human accomplishment of my lifetime, in many ways, in terms of human flourishing and human welfare. Now, in an autocratic setting, what that means, though, is that once a society becomes used to 6 to 10% growth, you better continue that 6 to 10% growth, because underlying all of that 6 to 10% growth is a lot of policies that do not benefit a lot of people, or that, trample on property rights. And some people will say, oh, that it's great. If China wants to build a road, they're going to build a road. Who cares where, what happens to the people whose property is on the point where they want to build a road. And it is from a, maybe a global perspective more efficient, but on the other hand, it really, at least in the short run, on the other hand, it really decreases incentive to build on property when, it can be confiscated or used for other purposes at any time. As long as China's growing at 6 to 10%, something like that, the government's not going to be in trouble. We're already starting to see some real signs of slowdown. We're definitely seeing massive signs of population slowdown. China's really far below replacement and is expected, I've seen projections anywhere between, say, 200 million people by the end of the century, which again, it's at 1.4 billion right now. That would, I doubt that it would come to that, but clearly, there's going to be massive population decrease. There's likely at some point, and we're probably already experiencing it. It's really hard to know what the numbers are actually like in China. There's likely an economic slowdown that's happening now, certainly going to happen over the next couple decades. If the political institutions don't change, in many ways, I kind of fear for the economic future of China, and that also means the economic future of the world, because the world is obviously very highly interrelated in the world economy, and China's, along with the U.S., are the two major players right now. So massive economic failure in China would mean bad things for the rest of the world, both economically and politically. So this is all to say that, again, you don't need, and really the types of things that happen to come together in Britain only needed to happen once. Once that kind of engine of growth started, it spread to different parts of the world that didn't have all of those features. China very clearly doesn't have the type of political institutions we're talking about that were key to this happening in Britain. It was able to adopt, and Britain was able to adapt China was able to adopt technologies. They were able to adopt business organizational forms, different ways of organizing the economy. The way they organized their market economy was transferred over from elsewhere. So while you don't need all of those things to grow now, you do need some of those things to maintain. And a big one is our political institutions. I think this is one of the big questions for the next couple decades that obviously none of us have an answer to, because we're going to have to see how it plays out. But there's reason for optimism, but I also think in the case of China, some reason for some pessimism as well.
I'm also a China pessimist, but I don't have anything to add.
All right, so I just want to kind of give a final pitch for this thing. So Robert Lucas, Nobel Prize-winning economist, once said something to the effect of, like, once you start thinking about economic growth, it's hard to think about anything else. Hopefully this conversation has kind of convinced you that Lucas is correct, that these are really, really important issues. And I think that the great thing about this book is that this book is very accessible both to PhD economists and to people who know zero economics, who are just kind of interested in any of the kind of topics that we talked about here. And so I think that, like, if you pick up this book, I think that you can get a lot out of it. I think it's a very valuable resource. And not only that, especially if you're coming to this as somebody who doesn't know the literature, as you're going through it, like, they're citing where a lot of these arguments are coming from. And so if you're really interested in this stuff and you come across some interesting argument in the book, like, it's going to lead you to these other resources that, and you can go read those arguments in a little more depth, and you can kind of, develop your own opinions and develop your own thoughts about some of these things. And so I think this is a really great book, and I think we should kind of thank these guys for coming and talking to us about it. Yeah. So I think I timed that well. So we'll try to ask some. We'll open it up for audience questions.
Well, thank you guys so much for the presentation. So my question has to do with the idea of being rich. So anyone who's read Aristotle, John Locke, Adam Smith, Milton Friedman, knows that money is merely a medium of exchange, and the exchange is for goods and services. So have we really gotten richer in terms of just GDP calculated by US dollars, or in terms of the quality of the goods and services that we have today? So number one export, exports of America, tourism, weapons that, sow death and destruction around the world. Maybe we import tons of cheap consumer goods from China. We've exported customer service to India and so forth. So is it possible for the quality of our life to decrease while the GDP increases?
So I can answer that. So I understand where you're coming from, but the question is, the answer to the question is categorically, we have gotten richer on all the dimensions we would care about, and our measures of GDP, things are complicated, and so obviously as we get, as countries develop, and we might have less leisure time, we might spend less time with our family, right? Some margins, not every single margin goes up equally for all people, but in terms of the range of experiences, different ways we can experience life, on every single metric one can imagine, we are orders of magnitude better than any society before the Industrial Revolution. So I think so if we think about you might disbelieve me and think, well, in the Athens of Plato or Aristotle, or in things were better, or maybe in Renaissance Italy, right, things were better. But whenever we have any data about number of people who can pick up a hobby which gives them meaning in life, right? It's a tiny sliver of the population who could do philosophy in ancient Athens or become artists in Renaissance Italy. So even though people are skeptical of the numbers, GDP actually, despite being a flawed measure, is actually a very good proxy for other things we care about. So in every survey, riches are associated with basically being happier. Poverty is horrible. People who are poor, stressed, they find it difficult to make decisions. They report being less happy. So I think the skepticism with respect to our current prosperity is actually understandable but unwarranted.
Hey, so in y'all's descriptions, you talked about sort of the confluence of factors that have to come together between institutions and technologies, and it all sounds very sort of continuous. And I guess I'm wondering if maybe it's more discrete than that, especially in terms of technologies. So, maybe you get agriculture, and then, okay, you're really set for a while, and you get industry, and you're really set for a while, and maybe there's some institutional ones too, but to what extent is that more small number of discrete advances a possible explanation? And if it is plausible, does that give us a more pessimistic view on the sort of Malthusian trap where, maybe the dominoes don't line up anymore?
Yeah, I mean, I think, if we look at really the leading explanations of industrialization, what changed, it is precisely this distinction between discrete change and continuous change. The issue with the pre-industrial world in terms of why something like industrialization didn't happen was not that innovation didn't happen. Even in what used to be called the Dark Ages in Europe, innovation, some types of innovations did happen. The medieval period saw several types of innovation, the printing press, eyeglasses, things like that. Compass, that at least a lot of them were reinvented from China, of course. But we did see these types of innovations occurring in a very discrete way, as you say. The main issue with all of those types of innovations, though, is that they didn't build on each other. There was nothing, you would have a printing press that would come about which would transform a whole host of things, and eventually, books would become a big thing, and eventually that leads to, greater literacy, things like this, well down the road. But in terms of innovation, what really distinguishes late 18th century Britain and then those places that kind of became industrialized and became leaders themselves, including, so in the 19th century, this would include the US, it would include certain parts of Northwestern Europe, it would include certainly Germany and France, is the increased rate of innovation. I think that if, when reading through this literature, there's a lot of people actually in this literature that kind of disagree exactly why it happened. What they broadly agree with, though, is what needs to be explained. And what needs to be explained is why we have such a rapid change in innovation. And now there are some people that have been technological pessimists about kind of the current period. Are we seeing a slowdown in the rate of innovation? And that's possible. It's certainly not possible to the extent that we're going to be seeing going back to a discrete world. I kind of like that terminology. We're just kind of, I think, possibly, and even, I wouldn't even say maybe with stuff like AI, we might not even be there, but we're certainly not going back. We might just be going to a slower, continuous world. But really, if we are thinking about technological changes discrete, then it really doesn't explain the big transitions. I don't know. Okay. Yeah.
So you briefly addressed it in your talk some time ago, but what would be your stance, I suppose, on the major schools of thought concerning how colonization and more specifically the Columbian Exchange impacted the trajectory towards the Industrial Revolution and the trajectory towards the world becoming rich?
Yeah, I can take that. So Jared, I think, gave you a broad outline of the thinking about it. I can add to it. I'll try and add to it in two ways. So the first, there's a very simple kind of economist response to this, which is not fully satisfying, but it's a baseline answer, which is that the scale of growth we see after 1800, it's so transformative that can't be explained just in terms of extraction of surplus from other parts of the world. Partly because we see, previous empires, like say the Roman Empire, extracting a lot of surplus, and that making Rome a prosperous city, making Roman senators very rich, giving them loads of access to slaves, but it doesn't transform the economy. So that's kind of one reason why colonization itself doesn't seem to be that's one reason to caution against the role it plays. Now, if we kind of get more into the history and kind of delve a little bit deeper, I think there is a case to be made that the particular economic configuration we see in late 18th century England was one where colonial trade, so particularly trade based on the Caribbean sugar islands, where they had plantation slavery, was potentially important for the British economy. And so for a long time, economic historians have been somewhat skeptical about how important, because the Industrial Revolution was really taking place in the north of England, northwest England, places like Liverpool, Manchester, the Midlands, and often the parts of the economy more connected with the sugar slavery nexus were, say, Bristol. And so we kind of thought that these are distinct. So there's some guys getting rich off plantation slavery, but they're not necessarily the people who are innovating in cotton textiles and so on. And so that's why when we wrote the book, we didn't think there's a smoking gun for a link between Britain's colonial empire and the Industrial Revolution. Since our book was written, there is a kind of quite compelling original paper by Stefan Helblick, Stephen Redding, and Joachim Voth, which actually looks at the locations in England where where people were paid compensation for having owned slaves in the Caribbean in the 1830s, and it correlates that with industrial development and economic development, and they do find a positive relationship. So, in light of that kind of new research, I would say there might be some link, but that paper suggests a link. But it also suggests a link which is kind of relatively small in size. So it depends on the question you're asking, basically. If you're asking the question, what was colonization the key driver of the Industrial Revolution? I still don't think it was. But did it play a role? Yes, it probably did. And And it's going to be very difficult for us to uncover this counterfactual, which is, like, imagine there was no empire, no exploitation, would there still have been an industrial revolution? That's a very difficult counterfactual question to answer. A lot of economic historians think there probably would have been, but we can't answer it fully.
Hi. Earlier on in the lecture, y'all talked about how population growth was important to sustained economic growth into the future. But kind of, from my understanding, like a lot of policies aimed at incentivizing that, like child tax credits, like they might move the needle a little bit, but they're not super successful at like getting back to at or above replacement. So kind of like, what would your solution be to population growth?
Oh, God. If I had an answer to that, I would be a very, very wealthy man, I think. I honestly, I don't know what a good solution is, because this is one of these issues where I think that cultural change has very, very clearly happened on many dimensions in such a way that really maybe incentivizes is not necessarily the right word, but really where having fewer children is really a cultural phenomenon as much as it is anything else. And part of it is, of course, economic. It's expensive to raise kids and things like this. And we now, of course, want to really invest in the children we do have, meaning that it's really expensive. But there's also really cultural elements, and cultural elements are one of these things that are really hard to change. We don't have a great idea in whether we even want to change them in the first place. I think that that when we're thinking about populations, we also do need to think about world population, not just population, say, within a specific country, United States. And of course, that does mean that freedom of movement of population, I think, is a really important thing. Taking people where there are large populations but maybe not so much economic opportunity, bring them to places where there is much more economic opportunity, is really among the lowest of the hanging fruits out there in terms of really changing the composition, I would say, of the population, which also does, when that happens, there are benefits and negatives to the social/cultural side. When we bring people from different cultures together, that can create tensions, but it can also create really great things as well. I live in Southern California, which is very there's a ton of different cultures within really my neighborhood, and there's really a lot of benefits that do come from this, including the types of cultural attributes that in terms of views on children. And I think that could be the type of thing that cultural diffusion in such a way that where societies where having more children is lauded rather than not. Not that in these places like the rich world, the U.S., it's not so much that people look down upon people that have more than two kids, but actually to some extent if we're now a little bit older. If you see, like there definitely are people that you see around. They have 5 kids. So how interesting, and that's a cultural thing. That's something that policy in itself is going to be very, very hard to change. So I actually, for my 2 cents, and you might have a very different opinion on this, but this is actually, I don't think, a question we've been asked before, is that it's really about kind of bringing. For several reasons, allowing freedom of movement. And one of those has to do with culture, but really a lot of it has, when we think about the role that an expanding population plays, it's not just an expanding population, it's an expanding population that has access to resources. We don't just need more people, we need more people that aren't worried about where the next meal is coming from. We need people that are able to invest in their children so their children have are sufficiently educated so that they can be those that come up with the spark of genius. Yeah.
So, I totally agree with Jared about the cultural element to low fertility. I mean, to be honest, it's we like to think, like people want to have everything right, perfect before they have kids. So that's a problem because you want to have financial security, you want to be in a safe place in your professional life, you want to have done all the things you want to do as a young person, like travel and see the world, and then you come along and it's your late 30s and it's kind of too late, and it's difficult, basically. So it's that's common across the entire Western world. So, but I'm more pessimistic. I think considerably more pessimistic than Jared is about the consequences of immigration, given the effect of large-scale immigration on institutions and culture. Based on more pessimistic than I would have been 5 or 10 years ago, really based on what I see in Europe, where there has been a lot of large-scale immigration and there's been a lot of political issues, basically.
Thank you for the discussion. It was very interesting, except for the part about Rome. That was kind of disheartening to hear that, Julius Caesar was 5'2". But so my question is thematically tied to a lot of the others, I think, that have been asked before. But you spoke of, in economics, institutions can incentivize behaviors that either are conducive or I guess you could say frustrate growth, human flourishing and such. My question is, can markets, and in particular free markets, be seen as one of those institutions that either go on to promote prosperity or frustrate prosperity? So not just a virtuous circle, but potentially a vicious circle as well. So markets are crucial. They're like the most important thing in terms of without them, it's very difficult to coordinate large-scale economic activity. So I would say they're a precondition for any large-scale complex society. We have counterexamples of societies which have tried to do away with them, and the Soviet Union being one, and they've basically been unable to do away with them. So the Soviet Union purportedly planned the economy, but actually black markets were very common, and they had to reintroduce money and wage differentials. So I think markets are the prerequisite for prosperity. Now, what people mean by free markets, sometimes the devil is in the details. And so if you think about what policy reformers argue about, we could go into a whole trajectory. I'll try to. I won't do that. We could down a rabbit hole basically about say intellectual property rights. So U.S. patent lawyers or international bodies now think that free markets mean very, very strict copyright, very, very strict intellectual property rights, and that may or may not be a good. That may or may not be good. It has costs and benefits. But if you look at previous societies, they didn't necessarily have these to nearly the same extent. And so when we say free markets, what exactly do we mean in terms of what contracts are legally enforceable? It's good, but as a general principle, I think that any society that renounces or turns its back on markets is basically condemning itself to stagnation as a broad principle. But of course, there's going to be details. China is another example, right? China, we believe China's rapid growth in the last 40 years is strongly associated with market reforms and market liberalization. But of course, they didn't go all the way towards what we would consider a fully free market, yet those reforms seem to have been sufficient for them to have grown very rapidly. So a hypothetical based upon something I know a little bit about. So early modern political theory, right? There was a concern about commerce creating luxury, and luxury becoming detrimental to the flourishing of a society. One argument would be too great luxury can lead to changes in political institutions, right? Democracies becoming oligarchic or even tyrannical, and then those becoming detrimental to the exercise of markets and therefore flourishing. So in light of that, I would agree, every society has a market, but is it that, I guess my question is, the trade-offs, right? Are we maybe too optimistic about the trade-offs?
So you're thinking Rousseau, Harrington, these early modern thinkers, and so I'm not saying those concerns are wrong, but as economists, we kind of side with Hume and Smith in that intellectual debate, right? So Hume and Smith are very, we're saying actually, commerce is, ennobling maybe. It's not going to lead to the denigration of democracy. So we're kind of optimistic on that, I think. But of course, you can't rule out, there's some future technology might be so damaging or so incompatible with human nature that indulging it or allowing it could have all these corrupting bad influences. We can't rule that out. So there might be some trade-off, right? Maybe AI will do this. Maybe virtual reality, there's going to be such good virtual reality that some companies will sell you the virtual reality and you'll just be trapped in it and you'll have no incentive to work or interact with real people, right? You'll just do everything in virtual reality. Right? That could be very bad for democracy, could be very bad for society, could be bad for fertility. So we can't rule any of that out, of course. But I would say that as economists, we're very much heirs to this relatively optimistic tradition that Adam Smith had, which was like commerce is generally good for peace, generally good for encouraging human cooperation, and it doesn't lead to vice and degeneration.
We're out of time now. Thanks, guys. That was absolutely fascinating. I know everybody in here was fascinated by that, too. Would everybody give them a round of